Welcome back, happy listeners, to our episode Plantiful Thoughts. We are having such a great season with SMT. We want to thank you again for all your support through this season's series In and Out of the Fray, and now we continue our season with an episode that actually started last season in November. And it all began with movie night with Nigel and I watching The Happening, a 2008 film by M. Night Shyamalan. Then Nigel brought up a book after we had seen that movie that he had been wanting to finish for ages, The Secret Life of Plants by Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird. So, Nigel, why did you want to read this book so much?
Well, let me just first mention that I sort of have a little bit of a bias for this book because it was published in the same year that I came into the world, 1973. So I have I'm a bit partial. But beyond that, I think what I find really interesting about this book is it brings into focus the question of plant sentience versus plant science. And that's a big discussion, and we're going to get into some of that, of course. And there's been a lot of other books that we're going to talk about that also deal with plant science and maybe going a step beyond. And but the question it brings for me is like, maybe I have questions of my own about what science can really offer us, how it can help us understand our relationship with not only plants but just all other sentient beings. So that's it in a nutshell. What science is capable of in terms of like the if you're starting with the hypothesis that everything in the universe is connected, and you're starting with that, and then that's obviously science is like the wet blanket and says no, you got to prove it. And so I guess that's kind of like the frustration is so much of our I like to recall this quote or phrase I've heard about, today's magic is tomorrow's science. And so it's just kind of giving some scientific basis to what we already understand instinctively, intuitively.
Well, and that's kind of why I wanted you to see this film so much. I mean, I always go for it's true, I always go for the movies first. There's always a book to back it up, but I always go for the movies first. I can always come up with something. I had seen this movie a long time ago. I mean, again, it came out in 2008. But what fascinated me was that they sounded like they knew what they were talking about in the movie. This concept that plants can communicate with each other. And, there's always been this argument whether or not animals have feelings. Do they communicate with each other? Can they communicate? Can they emote to us? Between us, how close are we to our dogs? How close? Do they really connect with us? And so when they had suggested, when this movie, The Happening, had suggested that, the plant world, the plant kingdom was angry and decided, all right, it's time to knock off some of these pests. We're seen as pests,
right,
in this film. I thought that was interesting. And so I actually looked it up. I went, onto, Google, as so many of us do. And there is a science behind it. That's actually where I had come up with this book that I had seen online, What a Plant Knows, by Daniel Chamovitz. Mm-hmm. So when you had mentioned The Secret Life of Plants, see, then, Nigel and I, then we have to both read everything. Mm-hmm. But plants can actually, when they feel threatened, they can emit toxins into the air. That is true. That was depicted in the film. It is true that they can emit toxins that can ward off other pests. And a plant can not only defend itself, but then it can also nurture other plants around them. They can actually start acting as a family. Not just aspens do this, where they say that the aspens here in Colorado are one of the largest living organisms on the planet. It's not just one group of trees that can do that.
Right.
Other trees can group together in order to protect themselves.
Right.
And so I found this fascinating. Where does that take us? Does that mean that they're actually communicating, or is it a process of adaptation?
Right. Who's to say? Yeah. I mean, like what kind of in this science fiction kind of scenario, how much of a stretch is it to think, that this is something that plants are already doing they're organizing, they're communicating to defend themselves against a threat or a pest or something that's harmful. So, what would it really take? What's the leap that we have to take in this film and in science fiction? But yeah. There's all kinds of communication going on not just between plants, but plants and other species, like even human beings.
Well, yes, and that was the thing that was brought up in A Secret Life of Plants. It was, what I'm taking is that The Secret Life of Plants, this, Tompkins and Bird, they are going at this from more of a feeling perspective, that plants have feelings and emotions and therefore consciousness, versus, say, the school of thought, Chamovitz, who is maybe not so into the, emotion and sentient being aspect.
Right, exactly.
He's more of that they do communicate, but it is more of a survivalist perspective. It is out of surviving and thriving versus emotion and thought. Consciousness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a in his book, he comes right off the bat, and I actually have a quote I would like to share. It's so depending on what camp you're in, and maybe there's a whole big spectrum in this and discussion, of course, but he doesn't make any secret about this. And he starts off the book. He says, "My book is not The Secret Life of Plants. If you're looking for an argument that plants are just like us, you won't find it here. As the renowned plant physiologist Arthur Glaston pointed out back in 1974, during the height of interest in this extremely popular but scientifically anemic book, we must be wary of, quote, bizarre claims presented without adequate supporting evidence, unquote. Worse than leading the unwary reader astray, The Secret Life of Plants led to scientific fallout that stymied important research on plant behavior as scientists became wary of any studies that hinted at parallels between animal senses and plant senses." So that's pretty strong. He's like, he thought the book was like a deterrent.
And see, but I will go so far as to say, though, then in the next section, literally right after he makes that statement, he goes into saying, "I'll present both a historical perspective and a modern look at the topic. I've chosen to cover sight, feeling, hearing, perception, and memory. And while I'll devote a chapter to smell, I'm not focusing on taste here. The two senses are intimately connected." He's actually sitting here. In one paragraph, he's saying, consciousness, feeling, emotion, but they might actually smell. I don't know if that's contradictory to what he's.
Yeah, it's just breaking it down into very specific physiological, biological phenomena.
And yet he's claiming that the plants don't actually have a nervous system, but that they have all these senses. And he goes through with all these chapters that they are sensing. But without a nervous system.
Yeah.
Really
so
like to
I have
get this guy on
well,
here.
it's interesting. I had a couple of I was looking on Goodreads, and I was looking at like what are the people saying that really enjoyed the book, and what about versus the people who couldn't stand it. So there's one that says, this is from Chaz. He gave it 1 star, and he says, to be completely honest, I truly wanted to believe that some of the secrets in this book are true. Perhaps some are, but even with a very open mind, I had a hard time swallowing most of this New Age pseudoscience. In addition, this book is poorly organized, in dire need of editing, and at times deadly boring. But he's basically saying that it doesn't follow this. He goes on to say later, the research was not done under double-blind, rigorous scientific protocol. So you got this kind of a camp of people who just dismiss it as New Age pseudoscience, which, I don't know. I mean, you can question some of the processes that were used in these experiments, and some of them were, and even the people who enjoyed the book. This next person gave it a 5-star review. They're not quite on board with the science end of it, right? Here's one from Eowyn. He says he gave it a 5-star review. He said, "What an extraordinary book this is. It doesn't follow the orthodox, well-trodden scientific pathway. Some parts are recognizably connected to, quote, regular science, and some are plainly loony. Mainstream science in many ways is blinkered and incapable of considering a lot of the radical material covered here. The most important thing, however, is that throughout runs a thread which recognizes the undeniable connections that exist between all living things, human beings and plants obviously included." So, yeah, it's just, again, it's like goes back to like what do we understand on an intuitive, instinctive level versus what science is capable of producing.
And yet, okay, they have developed all these instruments, and they talk about sensors being placed on the plant leaves, and when a stimulus is introduced to the plant, that they are detecting movement, action. So they're picking up on something through these sensors, and that's all very good. And some people may say, "Oh, well, that they consider that pseudoscience," and yet those kinds of applications are used in other fields, and they are considered valid. They are validated by other research teams, research organizations. But for some reason, when it comes to plants, somehow it's not applicable. I'm not understanding this. When, all right, there was another article I read a long time ago. I'm so sorry. I do not have the name of this, but they were talking about plants. Are they affected by us humans, by our actions, by the environment? And there was a story about this guy who had this like a half wall, and every time he would get a plant, he'd bring a plant home because that was the location where it received the most light. The problem is that he'd be rushing to go to work, and he'd end up, bumping the plant, and the plant would crash on the floor. The roots would be exposed. It'd just be demolished. Mm-hmm. Well, he noticed, because he wrote in to this person who knew about plants, and he's like, I'm finding this very odd. He's like, at first, my very first few plants, they did really well until I bumped them off the wall. He's like, but now I bring a plant home, and before anything actually happens, the plant just dies within a few days.
Mysteriously dies.
Mysteriously dies. And so this plant expert, and I'm so upset that I can't remember where I read this, but I did read it. This gal, she's like, well, there is a theory why your plants are automatically dying by putting them on this wall, because that energy field or whatever has happened to your other poor plants, a memory there, and so the plants are like, oh, I'm not gonna go out that way, and they'll just die off. So she's like, I'm gonna experiment with this, and she's like, unfortunately, some plants are gonna come to harm.
Right.
And so she did this, and lo and behold, she did find that eventually plants that had never been in her house before would go to this particular, she created a little space where a plant would just get knocked off.
Mm-hmm.
Her plant actually, again, never had been in her house, brand new plants right from the nursery. She'd set it on this thing, and within a few days it would die without even anything happening to it. She'd water it, it'd get light, everything it needed, they would just automatically die. So then she was like, well, let me test this. Let me try something else out. Again, less scientific, but took another plant, put it, from her house, one that had been there, one that had no disease, nothing. She had tended to it for a long time. It started to die. So she grabbed the plant and put it elsewhere. She didn't want any more plant deaths. But less scientific. How can you argue that?
Yeah. Okay. It just seems like there's so much that we can we can understand it on a level and yet not be able to prove it. And this is, I guess, one of the things that I always come back to when thinking about science. I heard this. I don't remember where this came from, but it kind of blew my mind. Every time I hear it, it's like, oh yeah, that's true. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So it's like, if you're trying to prove something, just because you don't currently have the means to, demonstrate X phenomena or whatever, it doesn't
why
mean
it happens, the
right,
mechanism.
Right. So, it's interesting. It's like there's some sort of memory associated with the place that somehow plants are picking up on, so
that's a feeling. That's a feeling sensor. It's not. It's not a neurological thing that seems to me like almost like a human would go into a house that is haunted and would have
something is
the
not
hair,
right here. Exactly.
the hair on the back of our necks stand up and our arms and we're like, we need to leave.
Yeah. So if plants had hair on their leaves, it would be standing up. They're like, something is not right in here. Something is very, very wrong. I need to get out of here. But of course,
they can't walk.
They're quite limited by terms of movement. But so our guest actually, we had the good fortune of interviewing Mark Cullen, who wrote a review of Chamovitz's book, What a Plant Knows, and he talked about one of the things he talked about was the plant's memory, and it was a great interview with Mark, and definitely go check that out. But he said on his part on memory, he said a plant's ability to catalog experience in a memory may be hard for us mere mortals to fathom. However, when a pea plant is exposed to light and a tendril stimulated by rubbing it with the finger, the tendril will coil around it as if holding on to the finger, like a baby who grips your finger when you place it in their palm. The interesting thing is that when the same pea plant is placed in a dark room 2 hours later, it spontaneously coils around your finger without having to rub it. So, there's
almost like a sense of security.
Yeah. So it does retain some sort of memory, and it talks about that too. He goes on to talk a little bit about the Venus flytrap, and he says the Venus flytrap can remember when the tiny hairs on its trap are touched at one end, and the hairs at the opposite end touch 20 seconds later. In fact, it is only with that brief interval of time that the trap will shut, as this timing is used by the plant to determine whether the predator is worth eating or not. So, yeah, they've got all these senses that that come into play. You know,
Well, and that's where Chamovitz's book, What a Plant Knows, he's talking about. I can see now. All right, he's talking about those senses versus feeling that are real. He acknowledges. I mean, at least he acknowledges that the plants do have some sense when light is direction. You know, the direction of the light changes, the plant will move. That is a kind of a sight. That is a kind of okay. And so when he's then talking about predators and pests, how reactive a plant can be. Again, senses. I mean, he's not saying that the plants don't have an intelligence. But I wish I could have a sit down with him and say, well, if they have an intelligence, then that must mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it must mean that they have some sort of consciousness.
right. That goes beyond a central nervous system and a brain. And see, yeah, we like to I mean, we sort of are sort of like, what is it? What's the word? Anthropocentric, like in our, we have to relate what we learn to us, right? Usually. Like, so it's like, okay, well, how does it, if it doesn't have a brain, how does it, we're kind of at a loss, right? It's like, well, yeah, it doesn't have, it's lacking these things. So therefore, how could it possibly think?
And yet, okay, I'm a person who has plants all over my house. Nigel has been to my house. He has seen my shelves full of plants. And I will tell you that I can visibly see, and this does not take a bunch of science and sensors and all these things to tell, if I'm in a good place, if I'm, good things are happening, everything's, kosher, my plants are happy. They thrive, even if I neglect them. And I'm so sorry, little darlings, as I'm looking at them right now. I can be neglectful. I can forget to water. I won't even say how many plants I have. It's just too embarrassing. But I even if I neglect them, they're still happy. But if, like, say something comes up, something upsetting happens, et cetera, I can literally see them droop.
You notice a
the
response.
Plants,
yeah.
Yes. That is not that. I mean, I don't know how a scientist could harness the technology to I don't know if it just, I mean, maybe it just takes a camera, like one of those, what are those time-lapse cameras? Where you document the person's emotion or state of mind versus the perkiness of a plant. But then how do you, like, decipher, well, did it get enough water, blah, 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 blah. I can tell you, I'm looking at them. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I need to water them all now. But but there's a visible change.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, well, you brought up time lapse. That's an interesting way. Like, that's like a lot of the documentaries on plants use this, and you can see all kinds of things going on in terms of, like, and so, how are they behaving? It's like, only until relatively recently we didn't really understand how they even moved, really. And then, time-lapse photography definitely enabled us to see things in a new way.
Not only that, but think about the other movie that we watched, What the Bleep Do We Know? Made in 2004. It's available on Amazon, but it talks about this scientist, Masaru Emoto, and he wrote The Hidden Messages in Water. And what he did was, and I think this is totally relevant to this discussion on whether or not plants have a relationship with us, are responsive and reactive to us, to our energy, in that in the movie and in his book, he took droplets of water, and he had, say, that those jars of water labeled, and he would put them in separate rooms, and in one room he would be screaming obscenities at, insults, just negative thoughts, negative words, negative phrases at
Right.
one jar of water, and in the other, it was given the complete opposite. And when he took the water droplets, samples from the water jars, and put them under the microscope, the difference was kind of actually horrifying. To see the negatively charged water was it with the crystals, the structure of the water had just been squished.
Yeah.
It looked like a squished bug versus the snowflake-like crystalline formations in the happy water.
Right.
And as he points out, we're made of what is the percentage of water we're made of?
Yeah, like something.
If it affects us?
Yeah, a lot. It's like 70 something. Or maybe I'm thinking the planet is 70% water. I don't know. We're a lot of water too, in human beings. we got lots of water.
And so if we are, if we are affected by words, which that has, there's been a lot of talk about that. Mindfulness, all these things is now readily accepted that how we talk to ourselves, how we are affected by other people's words actually has a physical.
It changes on a molecular, you can see changes on a molecular level.
We can actually become sick. So again, a fifth grader watched that movie and took some plants and did the same thing with plants. And it was in the newspaper. I think it was back east. And this little girl, both plants were given over a 6-week period. They were given exact same conditions in different rooms, same amount of water every day, same amount of sunlight, distance from the window, et cetera, and the same plant, same kind of plant. And in one, she screamed at and did the same thing that this guy did with the water, and then the other plant got all kinds of love messages.
Right.
Well, you can imagine what happened. A fifth grader proved this. This was her science experiment.
So how do you take that to the next step? Where is the next scientific breakthrough? And if we can do all these experiments just on our own and make these observations on our own, what's gonna be behind pushing the next scientific breakthrough so that it even pushes the field of science maybe to I don't know. It's like we have all these, new ways of observing. We can hear beyond human hearing. We can see beyond human seeing, and yet there still seems to be lots of limitations in terms of what's considered acceptable science, right?
Right. What would be interesting is to see, there is a little bit of documentation because as people recognized, and it was talked about quite a bit when the pandemic hit and everybody went inside, entire ecosystems came alive again. They revived themselves just from our absence. So I wish somebody, if they were paying attention to that, I wish somebody would then go ahead and pay attention to what is happening now with all the stress and the things that are going on, around the world, right? These devastating events that are happening right now. It's too bad somebody wasn't paying attention to those same ecosystems, just seeing if they are affected, because then you're talking about negativity on a worldwide scale.
Right.
You're talking about, several people now they're out and about and they're sending off, they could be giving off all this stress. It would just be interesting if a group would notice what is happening to the foliage, what is happening to the vegetation in those areas, not just from, physical devastation, but I'm just curious, emotional devastation, because there was a clear marked difference when we all went inside and left nature to be alone.
Yeah, we just let things chill out for a while and just stop our Well, everything, like global transportation is like that. That in itself, it's like we're burning fossil fuels and all this stuff. So when that even slows just a little bit, yeah, you can notice a difference. I mean, we still have lots of carbon emissions, of course, but it didn't go totally unnoticed. I mean, many people pointed that out. It's like, if we slowed down, and actually Mark Cullen talks about that in an interview. And I hope everyone checks that out too. That interview is wonderful. Talks about just, I don't want to give it away. I want people to listen to it, but just slowing down and observing what is happening. So
yeah, it was very good.
Yeah. So, did you have any other things you wanted to throw in before we wrap up?
Just that I truly believe that between the two books, between the the science behind the fact that plants can respond, I absolutely am a believer. The science experiment of a 5-year-old, fifth grader, on the East Coast. I don't think it's so far-fetched that plants do feel. Plants have some form of consciousness. It took us forever to come to the conclusion that animals do have emotion, do feel a connection, do have family connections. Just because, it took us a while to get to that understanding with them, maybe it'll just take us a little bit longer to get to the same place with the plant kingdom.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get there eventually. Hopefully. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed our discussion today, you'll definitely want to check out our bonus episode with Canada's gardening guru, Mark Cullen. You can also find links to the material we discussed in this episode. You can find SMT on popular social media and podcasting platforms like SoundCloud, Google, Apple, and iHeartRadio. Please stay tuned as we've got a couple more episodes to finish out our spring season. Until next time, Nigel and Natty out.